we develop another point, namely that in order to win wars, you not only need guns, you also need people fighting the wars. You need motivated soldier to fight wars. And starting in the 17th century, wars, for a variety of technological reasons, wars became a mass thing. I mean, in the time where Giacomo previously talked about country growing in peace, I think what he meant to say that before the 18th century, peace meant that country fought war, but were little things with mercenaries, a few thousand mercenaries fighting with each other, but not, I mean, a war between France and Spain in the 15th century, probably the average French person didn't even know there was a war going on because there was a small armies. But then wars became a mass thing, and here we have some numbers that French troops went from 65,000 in 1498 to, you know, basically everybody, or 8 million during the Second World War. So there was an increase in the size of armies. And there is this view amongst historians that this, yes?
So when you say 65,000, does that include the soldiers of all these local landlords in France, or just?
I have no clue. I have no clue. All I know is that in the 18th century, wars were small things compared to the Second World War. Don't ask me more details about it, but maybe Alessandro knows. But
historians have different ways of measuring.
Yeah.
But this didn't start with Napoleon, that made armies of civilians that before were essentially all.
Yeah, I mean, in France, it started with Napoleon. Later, and in fact, we will debate what leads to earlier on. But so far, the point I'm making is that wars went from being a small thing to being a mass thing, and in fact, the argument will be that in order for Napoleon or other leaders in other countries to get the armies to fight, they need to give concession, need to create incentives for people not to rebel and do something when they introduced conscription. So for people not to rebel against conscription, for people to fight. For example, we were reading stuff about the fact in France in particular, before the type of Napoleon border region in France were not cooperating with the troops. When the troops were crossing, they were not supporting the troops, they were not giving them food and so on, because we were basically rebelling against the military build-up. So the point of the paper is that for the elites, for the ancien regime elites that were turning into more modern state, the process of turning into more modern state was to make some concessions to the population in order for have the population participate in the war effort that at the time was becoming, because of technological progress, was becoming a mass thing as opposed to a small things among mercenaries. So basically, the point of the paper is that one of the effects of industrialization was technological advances that make wars a mass thing as opposed to a small thing. So the industrialization with a set of technological progress led to the fact that armies became mass armies as opposed to small groups of mercenaries, as a big historical literature tells us. So what this paper does is, for the most part of the paper, to hold constant the story that we know about, namely that in order to finance all this mass this mass production of military goods, we hold that constant. We know that, and we will, at the end of the paper, if we have time, we'll talk about that too. But for the let's keep that given. We know that. We analyze another issues, which is how to spend given a tax capacity of the government, how to spend it. How to spend it in a way that increases the incentive for the population to participate in war, or at least not to rebel against the war effort. So in our model, the citizen of a country will be motivated to fight the war and not to rebel against conscription when they compare the benefit of winning a war with the cost of losing a war. Now, clearly, the benefit of winning a war depends on what your country is doing for you. If your country is doing virtually nothing for you, then you don't care at all about winning the war. So the elite have to do something in order for you to appreciate the fact that if you lose the war, that you lose sovereignty and you are conquered by an enemy, you actually lose something. And therefore, this is the incentive for the elite to provide that something that makes the citizen willing to fight a war. And the paper will be about discussing various ways of providing that something that makes a population want to participate in the war. So, in particular, we will talk about that this incentive will the need to have population fight the war will create incentive for the ancien regime to start providing public goods. When I say public goods, I don't mean guns. I mean peaceful public goods, I don't know, education, roads, infrastructure for the population to make them feel that if I lose the war, they're losing something. And how much of this public good they will produce, and they will induce elites to engage in various forms of nation building and nationalism, and how the two, public good and nationalism, interact. So the main result that we have is that in the ancien regime, when the technology was such that armies were relatively small and they were essentially mercenaries, the elite did not need to do really anything other than pay the mercenaries to fight the war, perhaps paying them with the loot of war, so and they didn't need to do anything to involve the mass population because the armies were small and often fought by foreign mercenaries. Actually, we have some data in the paper showing that many of those pre-industrialization wars were fought even with foreign mercenaries. But then when armies become big enough, then the spoils of war are not enough to motivate the soldier, and the elite have to switch to other form of incentives for the soldiers to fight and for the population to participate in war. And then here is when the interesting stuff happens, namely that you need to provide some public good for people to appreciate to be part of a certain country. But then we step into the related discussion to what we had earlier, namely that people within a country have different preferences about public goods, and then we enter into this issue of provision of public good and diversity of preference over the public good. And unlike in the previous paper, we have the heterogeneity heterogeneity of preference over the public good is endogenous, so it can be chosen by the government via indoctrination or nation building. And this indoctrination can have a positive or a negative spin, namely telling people, look how great our country is, or look how bad your enemy is. And these are two examples of positive indoctrination. I think this is an English poster from the First World War saying, look, if you lose the war, look what would be losing the beautiful countryside of England. And here is, I think this is an American poster about the Germans conquering, the nasty German conquering the world. So this is an example of positive nation building we are part of this beautiful country, and this is part of a negative nation building. They say, look how bad the enemy is, and we will consider both. So now, related literature, as I said, there's a big literature on state capacity, namely, we need to be able to collect taxes in order to fight war. We know that we're not going to go there because we are thinking about something else. Maybe at the end we will say something about that. There is an argument in a recent book by Sheave and Stavages that elites introduced the inheritance tax as a way of saying, look, you poor people are going to fight the war, but at least we compensate you by taxing ourselves and by sort of punishing ourselves for being so nasty to you, and look what we are doing, we are putting an inheritance tax. I don't know whether it is right or wrong, but that's their argument. There is a paper by Aguillon and others in which they say that in order to fight wars, elites had to introduce more education. I'm not 100% sure why education makes better soldiers, but perhaps more educated soldier can follow orders better. And then there is also related to work by Guizzo and others on the fact that countries that have fought wars trade less with each other because they don't like each other. And probably the most closely related paper is another paper by myself, Paolo Giuliano, and Bryony Reich, in which we look at also, we have a similar technology of nation building, but in that paper the point is not nation building to fight war, but is nation building to avoid secessions. So the argument in that paper is that when countries become sort of democratic around the end of the 18th century, in order to prevent secession, the elites had to create some form of homogeneity in the country. So that was homogenization to avoid secession. Here in this paper, we don't have secession, but we have wars. And there's another literature, there's a sort of another connection is here, is that in our paper, we are talking about provision of public goods, which in a sense is related to turning ancient regime that didn't do anything to modern nation state, which is somewhat related to democratization. And there is a literature about democratization as a result of internal threat. For example, the paper by Asimov and Robinson about elite conceding democratization because they were afraid of being overthrown. Here, we're not going to have internal threat. It's all a matter of external threat to the elites, but which will also lead to a process. We don't have voting, we don't have democracy, but the provision of public good, which is related to democratization. Yes?
Now that you are in democratization, I mean, a particularly dramatic case was at the beginning of the First World War, where the international socialists tried to convince workers that they should all unite against the bourgeoisie and not allowed to be broken through national lines. And of course, they failed completely. That it would be an interesting
that is actually, that is absolutely right. It's an excellent point. Alessandro, take note. That's exactly right. I mean, in some sense, what you're saying is exactly right, namely that in some sense there was a fight between feeling French and feeling a worker, yes. And in some sense the goal of nation building was to say first you're a French and then you are a worker, and first being a French in some sense won versus the that's absolutely right. So the online of my presentation will be first we talk about two countries. We have a world of two countries. We will in peace, and so we look at what happened in peace. Then we're going to look at wars. And to make things simple, so we have three things there are three variables that we are working with. One is nation building, which we'll model in a second, so the government can nation build or not. The government, which means the elite, can provide public goods or not, and this is the second variable floating around. And the third is the spoils, the rents coming from the spoils of war. If you win a war, you get the tax revenues of the defeated country, and the question is how you split it between the elites and the population, and then the third variable floating around, and the third thing is different types of nation building. So the three endogenous variables to keep in mind is how much public good to provide, how much of the spoil, how much rent the elite wants to keep, and different form of nation building. Yes?
Something else that the elite could have potentially done instead of nation building and kind of paying the cost of fighting the war to the population by providing public services is investing in more technology, right? So they could have invested into developing much better weapons so that they don't need that many people to fight the war. And to some extent, this is what has been happening since the First World War, right? So, I mean, can you...
Well, I mean, yeah, that...
Why this hasn't happened before that? Why they had to resort to nation building as opposed to...
Well, I think, I mean, in our model, technological progress is exogenous. Presumably, if I had built nuclear weapons before the First World War, we would not have had the Second World War. They didn't, presumably because, yeah, I mean, you're right. In principle, yes. In principle, if there were technological, I mean, at this point, in our analysis, the technological progress that historians talk about is the kind of technological progress that made mass armies feasible and necessary from mercenaries. The next step of technological process can be that you don't need big armies because you have these weapons, and they're probably right. That certainly has happened, but it didn't happen then, and we take that as exogenous. But yes, in principle, yes, if the elite could, if you go back to the ancien regime and when at the time on Napoleon and so on, if instead of building France, the elite could build an atomic bomb and say, don't touch me because I have an atomic bomb, and I don't care if people in Brittany couldn't care less about France. I don't care what they think because I have an atomic bomb and I can dump it on Berlin. Yes, then probably nation building would not have been necessary. But the First World War was certainly not fought in that way. It was fought by millions of people in the trench.
Well,
or whatever.
To me, the fact that they didn't invest in that seems to suggest that this solution was cheaper for them.
Well, I think you are being too kind to the model in the sense that we don't allow them to do anything else.
No,
but it's an interesting, actually, for historians, actually, it's an interesting question. Why did we went into a phase of mass armies as opposed to go from mercenaries fighting with swords, with mercenaries fighting with atomic bombs, and in the middle there was a mass army? That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer, but certainly it has happened. So we have two countries in the world, country A and country B. They are, the world is normalized from 0 to 1, the border is Q. The country B if we focus on country A, country B would be mostly exogenous, and the border is Q. CA and CB are the capital you can think of the capital of the two countries. By capital, we mean where the public good is. This is related to my earlier work that Giacomo has taught before, namely that the country provides a public good. The public good is located where the capital is, and the farther people are from the capital, the less beneficial the public good is. So country A is located between 0 and Q. Each country has ordinary people, which are distributed linearly in country A between 0 and Q, and then an elite of size SA, we will see in a second, and ordinary citizens pay taxes, TA, which we take it for most of the paper as given, precisely because we don't want to talk about building the state capacity of raising taxes, because that's analyzed by others, so we take that as given. And so apportion 1 minus pi A of tax revenues goes to the elite, and they are pocketed, and they spend them in whatever they want to, and the remaining fraction of taxes is used, so this is the budget constraint, so the fraction of taxes which does not end up in rents is used for the provision of the public good, GA, which is endogenous, of course, and homogenization, which I'll model in a second, but H times lambda is the cost of, H is the marginal cost of homogenization, and lambda is the level of homogenization, which I'll describe in a second. So the elite can spend in providing public goods or homogenizing if the elite chooses to do so. Of course, they can choose to have zero public good and zero homogenization, and set pi equal to 0 and take everything is rent. So pi, GA, and H are endogenous. So pi, GA, and lambda are endogenous. So the ordinary citizen have the following utility function. The second one is trivial, is consumption, which is all exogenous for the moment, and the public good component is equal by the utility is linear, increasing in the size of the public good. Theta is the marginal benefit, the benefit of the public goods, and this is the cost of the distance. So if you are individual I, you are located at this distance from the capital, I minus CA. Your benefit from the public good is decreasing with A. The higher is A, the lower is your, the more costly it is for you to be fast. So if A were 0, everybody would have the same benefit from the public good. If A is larger, the farther you are from the capital, the less you benefit from the public good. And we assume that A is less than 1, and of course theta is greater than 0, so the public good is beneficial, and distance is costly. And again, we want to think of distance in terms of, you can think of it geographical distance if you want to. You can think of distance between culture, different between languages, and so on. Whatever makes people different. And of course, the elite is in the capital, so the elite is in Paris. And if you are from Brittany, you don't really care about Paris. You have your own language. You are different, and so on. So homogenization, lambda, is a technology that makes people, that reduces the cost of distance from the public good. So lambda, which is between 0 and 1, is a parameter that comes into there, and the higher is lambda, in some sense it moves the ideal point closer to the capital. So it makes you, for given your location and given the amount of the public goods, you have a higher utility from the public good. The higher is lambda, and we model it. For the moment, we model it this way. For the next 15 or 20 minutes, lambda will be equal to 0, but it will reappear. It will reappear in a second. But this is the first technology of homogenization we have. And you can think of it as reducing the cost of distance, physical distance, like building roads, or forcing people to learn the same language, and or indoctrinating people in terms of forcing them to love Paris, even though they are from Brittany.
Sorry,
Yeah.
why forcing people to learn the same language, or
We'll see. That's part of the story. Yeah.
Okay, but this can also create some rebels in your country.
Right.
Force people to do that, not increasing nationalism, or not increasing love in France, but the contrary.
Yes, we don't. Right. We don't model, neither in this paper nor in the previous paper. We don't model reaction. we don't model not reaction. We don't model opposition to homogenization. I think as a black box, you can think of it as H, the cost of homogenization, H, including them the cost of repression of those who complain, you know, you can think of nasty form of homogenization in which you force all the Bretons to speak French, and those who rebel, you kill them, and at the end you get this thing. So, but yeah, we don't model that explicitly. But instead, if you think about it in terms of building road from Brittany to Paris, then nobody would necessarily oppose building road because there's no cost. Or if you teach Bretons French without forcing them to speak French, not that happened, but I mean, in principle, you can think of more or less peaceful way of homogenization. Interestingly, the parameter A measure how homogeneous a country is. If A is high, it means that the cost of distance is high. So the higher is A, the more dishomogeneous a country is. So, which will be an interesting parameter for later. So in peace, the elite, which is a measure SA, is located in the capital. It maximizes its benefit, and the benefit of the elite are given from the elite are in the capital, so they also benefit from the public good, like so if you build a swimming pool in Paris, the elite also benefit, so they have the theta times GA is the benefit for the elites of the public good. Their income, which is the same as that of the population, and that doesn't really matter, you can make it different, but you just add notation, plus the rents, which are 1 minus pi A times the total tax revenues divided by the size of the elite. So that's the utility of each member of the elite. So the first trivial proposition, when you are in peace, the elite chooses lambda equal to 0. There is no reason. Homogenization is costly. The elite doesn't care about the normal people. Why to choose to spend money to homogenize them? So lambda is equal to 0. Now, if one of SA is less than theta, namely if the value of the public good for the elite is high, then the elite chooses no rents and puts all the revenues in the public good. If this condition holds, if the public good is not particularly valuable versus the elite, the public good is 0 and the elite only gets rent. And we take this as the interesting equilibrium for the ancien regime, where the size of the elite were very small, and therefore the benefit of the rents per person were extremely high versus the benefit of public good. We don't think of Louis XV building public goods, but getting rents in his own pocket. So we take this as the interesting case. Now, what wars? So now suppose that for some reason country A and B gets into a war. The army size in country A is given by Q times K, where Q is less than chi times Q, where chi is less than 1. And we'll talk a lot about this chi, the size of the army. EA and EB are the total soldiers' effort in the two countries, which is of course endogenous, and the probability of country A of winning the war is the ratio of the total effort of soldiers in country A versus, so the ratio of the effort of country A over the total, which is standard in this literature. So what happens if in the model, if you lose the war, you lose your sovereignty. Your tax revenues are lost. They go to the other country, and you basically are annexed to the other country. Your capital moves to the other country. So if you are in country A, your capital becomes CB. So the public good is located. If Germany and France, if you lose against Germany, the capital goes to Berlin. All the tax revenues of France go to Berlin, and that's what happens if you lose. If you win, of course, the opposite happens. You maintain sovereignty. You get all the tax revenues of Germany, and then the elite gets all the tax revenues of Germany, and then they have to decide endogenously how much of these tax revenues of Germany goes to the population and how much are kept in rent. Okay, so so the time is that the elite in country A, first they choose their sort of institution, how much tax revenues how much of their tax revenues they give to the population, how much public good they provide, what is the share of spoils of war that the elite would keep versus giving to the population, and the amount of homogenization lambda. Then the war occurs, then whoever wins, wins, and then we have the payoff are paid, given what happened in defeat and victory. So, what is the expected payoff for soldier I of country A is, of course, the probability of victory times the utility of winning plus y minus the probability of winning times the utility of losing minus the effort of individual I. And we'll talk about the effort in a second, but that's the expected value of the war. And the net benefit of winning is, of course, equal to the difference between the utility of winning and the utility of losing. Now, an important thing to keep in mind, which will come back over and over again, is that the net benefit of winning and losing for different people in the countries are different. If you are in country A, you are located close to the border, and you lose the war, the capital goes to CB, but you're not that far from CB. So if you are in Strasbourg and France loses, you sort of speak German a little bit and not too far from Berlin, it's not that costly. But if you are in southern France or in Brittany, you are really far from CB, and you lose a lot. So the benefit of winning and losing are not the same across the population. And incidentally, we draw the capital in the middle, but it doesn't have to be. So the capital could be here, or the capital could be there, which different implication for the fraction for thing. But think about, for simplicity, for the capital being the middle. If you are on the right of the country, on the right of the capital or on the left of the capital, your cost of winning and losing are different, and in particular, the closer you are to the border, the lower are your costs under this first setup. Then we'll generalize this later, but under this setup, that's what it is. Okay. So now, this is how do we model effort? Of course, we have a continuum of soldiers, so the free rider problem is infinite. Nobody would put any effort in equilibrium because, for obvious reason. Of course, during war, that's why during war there are pretty serious pretty serious punishment for cowardly or for running away from the enemy. We don't. The way we model effort choice to avoid the free rider problem is a way that has been addressed by actually others in this related literature. Namely, we say we assume that every soldiers put the effort level that maximizes the expected return from war net to the effort cost. So impose that the effort of everybody is the same, and is the effort level that maximizes the net benefit of winning the war, which is this expression. So the individual, remember, Q is the size of the population. So the individual benefit of winning the war minus the effort cost, and we assume that everybody puts in the same level of effort that maximizes this expression. Yeah, it was a question?
So wouldn't you get with this that the elite wants to select soldiers, right? Sort of
Right.
like Roosevelt. I don't
Yes,
want
right.
Japanese,
If
but they're American
absolutely,
kings, so they don't love
absolutely. That's actually a very good point. You would want. There are two related questions to this. One is that remember the benefit of winning the war is higher for these people than for these people. So by imposing that everybody puts the same effort, we are essentially imposing that these people put the same effort as those people. An alternative way of modeling, which we thought about the other day, was not to impose that everybody puts the same effort, but to impose equal net benefit minus cost for everybody. So imposing not that the effort is the same, but everybody chooses different level of effort, but keeping their total utility constant. In which case you would get that people here are allowed to put less effort because they get less benefit. That's the first. The second thing is that, yes, the elite would have an incentive to choose these people to fight and not these people. But we don't allow that. We impose that for simplicity, we don't allow that. We impose that the army is representative of the country.
One question. Why is it not the ones close to the capital, the ones that lose the most?
No, the capital moves from here to here.
That's right.
So if you are here,
The maximum benefit.
These are the guys that lose the most if they lose the war. Because the guys at zero are already very far away.
no, but right, but the guys at zero, they go from here to here. They lose a lot, right?
What does the cost depend on? Does it depend on the distance or the square distance? Or what?
There are different configurations, so it's true that in some cases the net benefit is close to zero for a Q, and then it rises until CA, and then sometimes it's flat. So it depends on the parameters. How is for a given GA and GB, you may have, as we say, that.
Right, depends also on the size of GB.
Maximum for people in the capital, but when GA is equal to GB, it turns out that the net benefit is flat after GA, so it rises and then it becomes flat. So it depends on the relationship between GA and GB.
Right, I forgot to say that of course, GB is constant. The size of the public good in country B is held constant, but of course, if country B has a huge amount of public goods, then it's less costly for you to lose because at least you have all the public goods of country G. But if country G has a very small amount of public good, then it's more costly for everybody. So GB enters also in this calculation, yes.
So just one thought, because related to what was said before, I understand you don't allow it in the model, but something maybe that's interesting for you to think of is that you would have less incentives for nation buildings in countries like Britain and the US that go a long way with the voluntary armies. Because then you automatically have the selection of the people who decide to come to fight are already more patriotic. And then I don't have the problem of screening out the Alsatians, because if people from, I don't know, Dorset don't want to fight,
we have actually, we have some, right.
Welsh and Scottish regiments.
We have some related results that have to do with the degree of homogeneity, namely that we capture on the parameter A. If A is high, namely there is a lot of heterogeneity within the country, then sorry, let me do it that way. If you have a lot of homogeneity within the country, so if A is low, you have a lot of homogeneity, then everybody loves public good A. So talking outside the model, you don't really have to worry about who you put into the army because everybody loves public good A. But if the country is very heterogeneous, namely people here are very distant from point A, then if you put them in the army, you're not very sure about that. So it can be, in fact, we have some evidence which I won't show you, which we show that the timing of conscription, when country moved to compulsory conscription, is related to heterogeneity in the country. So going back to your question, yes, it is perfectly possible that in more homogeneous countries you have less incentives for minorities not to fight hard. That has implication for who you want to put in the army and all that. Yeah, sure.
Observation on this. In fact, I think up to maybe the beginning of the First World War, the military units were drawn from the same village. So,
Interesting. Interesting.
But then, because when wars became so destructive, then they found that all men of a village were killed, and then they started then mixing in the units people from different origins. It would be interesting to think whether there were incentives to make
Interesting.
Of the same exact town.
Presumably, that's actually a very interesting point. That presumably may have something to do with limiting free riding. So if you are from the same town and you see somebody you know that is cheating, then, but if you are from a different, that would be, actually, I didn't know that, was very interesting.
I don't know all that well my military history, so you can correct me, but one of the things that I think is true is that there's a lot of variation in this by country.
Variation of what?
In the local, so Britain has a regimental system. Traditionally, regiments are named after places because they recruit heavily from the same place.
It was in France.
But in other places, I think that this is less true. And then, of course, if you look at Germany versus France, we have the variation that Germany in peacetime has abandoned. I mean, the Bavarian army exists all the way until 1917, and so you can.
Yeah, I wasn't taking Germany and France very literally.
I know,
but
you could look at it, right? That
yeah.
France is recruiting, although I stand corrected, but there is the French army and a national
Right.
right draft. And in Germany, I think before 1915, there is some variation. Some people are
Right. You know, you're way ahead of me in terms of knowledge of military history, but I'll. Okay, so this is the effort decision, which is simplification. Something pretty obvious, the war effort in A, so the individual effort of the soldiers is increasing in both GA and holding constant everything the country B does. The more public good you have at home, the more you put in effort because you are worried about losing it. And of course, the more spoil from wars you get, remember gamma A is the fraction of the pay that you give the soldier, the spoils of war to the soldiers, the more the effort they put in. And the war effort is decreasing in GB, the more public good there is in country B. So if you lose the war, at least you get a lot of GB. And let me skip homogenization for a second because we'll get to that later. Because for the moment we are assuming that there is no technology for homogenization, and we're just talking about the trade-off between public good in country A and the spoils of war. So we're going to focusing on the trade-off between GA and gamma. So how much public good the elites provide and how much spoils of war they give to the soldier as opposed to keeping them in ranks. So the question is, what will the elite do? They provide. Will they use tax revenues to provide public goods, or they will only or not provide public goods and allow the troops to keep the spoils of war? And this is, let me give you a simplified version of the result. The glory details are in appendix, but if you exclude corner solutions, which we can deal with, but with some boring detail that at 6:15 in the evening are too boring. The story is, the basic result is the following, that when the army size is less than this number, the elite relies on spoils of war and provides no public good. Otherwise, when the size of the army is bigger than that, the elite provides public good, and they provide no spoils of war, and they keep all the spoils of war for themselves. So the idea is that when the size of the army is relatively small, it's enough for the elite to allow the soldiers to keep, the loot of war. But when the army size becomes too big, then remember that the public good is non-rival, so it becomes cheaper for the elite to provide a public good and not provide any spoils of war. So when you have small armies of mercenaries, you pay them with the spoils of war. When you have mass armies, it becomes too expensive. There is not enough revenues to do so, and therefore you provide this non-rival public good. And of course, so there is a cutoff in the size of the army, so that when the army is lower than K upper bar, you provide spoils of war. You have mercenaries. When K is above K bar, you provide public goods. So you turn into a modern country as opposed to a country which uses mercenaries. And of course, by the way, this thing is a combination of parameters, which is boring. Theta, the higher is the utility of the public good, so the higher is theta. Of course, the lower is K bar, because if people like the public good a lot, then it is cheaper for the elite to provide the public good, so K goes down. If people don't like very much the public good, then the elite needs to provide incentive with loot of war rather than public good. Interestingly, remember A is the parameter that captures heterogeneity. So the higher is A, the higher is K bar. So the degree of heterogeneity in the country is decreasing or increasing? I keep forgetting.
There is more heterogeneity, K bar.
No, but Robert, if there is more heterogeneity, A is higher.
A is higher.
Okay, so when A is higher, A is a parameter in the utility function such that when A is higher, there is more heterogeneity. So when there is more heterogeneity, K bar goes up. And that makes sense, because if you have more heterogeneity, people on average, they benefit less from the public good because the cost of distance is higher. So there is less of an effect of the public good because people far from the public good, they don't like it. So you need to provide more spoils of war for a higher level of the army. So in other words, if you are in a very heterogeneous country, you can provide a lot of public good in Paris, but if the Bretons are very different from the Parisians, they couldn't care less about the public good in Paris, so you need to provide them with loot of war, because even if you do a lot of wonderful public good in Paris, the Bretons couldn't care less. So you need to create incentive for them with loot of war. Instead, if Brittany is identical to Paris, they benefit a lot from the public good in Paris, and therefore it is cheaper for the elite to provide public goods than loot of war, even when this army size becomes bigger. Okay. Now there are some cases in which there are also corner solutions which I will not bore you with, but this is the basic intuition. So basically, this is the solution when the army size increases, we take the army size as exogenous in this paper, but it has to do with those technological changes that we talked about at the beginning. When the army size increases, first you pay the soldiers with more loot, and then you switch to the public good and zero loot, and the opposite for the public goods. Okay. Of course, the fact that there are jumps comes from the linearity. If you add a concave function, the two things may coexist, but with this linearity, they don't. Now, there is some interesting historical evidence, which I didn't know about until Alessandro found it, that there is this interesting work by this historian that says that from 1830 to 1938, yes, government spending in European countries increased and military spending increased, but there is, this quote mentioned that there is a big changes also in the composition of public spending, that in fact there was defense spending also shifted towards private public goods, and so that they want these historical evidence. These historians seem to suggest that more than an increase in the size of the government, there was also a shift in the composition of government spending towards private public goods, and they make an argument that this was as a part of a sort of a bargain between the elites and the population, saying, we provide some public goods in exchange for you to fight, or to make it more, at least to make it more costly for you to lose. So I think there are two things going on. One is the war increasing the fiscal capacity of the state because you needed to collect more revenues to pay for the war, but also this compositional effect of spending. So, what is the total amount of spending? The total amount of spending is going to give it by this condition. This is the marginal cost of public spending of the elites, which is how much of the rents they need to give up in order to provide public spending. And this is the marginal benefit of public spending, which is equal to the effect of increase in spending over the probability of winning, so the effect of more spending on the elasticity of the probability of winning. So the more you spend, the more effort people make, the higher is the probability of winning. And this is what we call the disagreement effect, namely how much more the elite cares about the net benefit of winning versus how much the population care about the utility of winning. So if the elite care more about, intuitively, the elite care more about the normal population, because if they lose the war, not only they lose sovereignty, they also lose all their rents. They really lose everything. So this is bigger than that. But think intuitively, if the bigger this disagreement is, the more the elites have a strategic incentive to increase the effort of the population because they lose a lot. Instead, if for whatever reason the population loses a lot, even without the incentive, see what I'm saying? The incentive to provide more public good is greater the more the elites care relative to the population from winning the war. Of course, there is this sort of, I already talked about the second result, more of homogeneity, lower A, raises the effort effect, namely people are more willing to fight because the country is more homogeneous, and that reduces the disagreement between elite and the population because the population and the elite are closer. And there's the spending contagion, which is sort of obvious that the higher the public good in country G, the higher is the incentive for country A to provide more public good, because the higher is the public good in country G, the lower the cost of losing the war, and therefore you need to create more incentive for the troops to fight by increasing GA. So there is a contagion of sort of nation building in the two countries. Okay, nation building. Very briefly. So nation building, remember the way we model nation building. Here I'm just repeating the equation that I put up before. Nation building means choosing lambda that reduces the cost of distance between individual I and the capital. So now the elite chooses gamma A, the fraction of loots that are left to the troops, GA, the amount of public goods that is produced, and lambda. Now, for the sake of simplicity and to keep your intuition easier, and my own intuition easier, let's assume that the capital, CA, is in the middle of the country. We can solve the other case, but it gets very complicated. But so let's assume that the capital is in the middle of the country. So the first result that we get is that there's a complementarity which is sort of very intuitive between lambda and GA. The more the elite, the higher is the amount of public goods supplied by the elite, the more beneficial is nation building. So if you have a large public good, then the more beneficial is nation building because the more people appreciate this public good. So there is complementarity between the two. And obviously, you get nation building only when you have a positive public good. If you have no public good, there's no reason to homogenize, because homogenization, it means to reduce the cost of distance from the public good. If you have no public good, of course, you don't homogenize. But if you have more public good, then you want to homogenize. And so we have the result that in equilibrium, homogenization is weakly increasing in GA. So the other result is that the possibility of nation building leads to a lower cutoff. Now remember that cutoff of army size, above a certain level of armies, I switch to public goods and move away from loots. If you can homogenize now, you have a lower cutoff. Namely, if you can homogenize, it is cheaper for the elite to switch earlier for a smaller size of government to nation building, because you have a new technology that increases the benefit of the soldiers from losing the war, because you can increase the benefit of the public goods. So if you can homogenize, you can use the technology of homogenization to increase the benefit of the public good, and therefore providing the public goods becomes more attractive relative to providing the loots of war, even for a smaller army. And complementary result is that higher lambda, so more nationalism, increases the effort in conflict, and because it makes you increases the cost of winning, and increases the benefit of winning and the cost of losing, because you moves you away from the other country's capital. Now there is one thing which is actually not obvious, which I will speak intuitively, that nationalism means that if you are here, the cost of distance from the capital CA goes down. More homogenization means that you become, in some sense, closer to CA. But becoming closer to CA with this technology of homogenization makes you also closer to CB. Okay, so if you are in Brittany and you become closer to Paris, you also become closer to Berlin. While if you are here, making you closer to Paris moves you away from Berlin. So there is this interesting something which, one of the few things that are not obvious until you write down the model, is that this type of homogenization moves Brittany closer to Paris, but also closer to Berlin. Now, there may be some form of homogenization that actually have this structure. If you want to be, if you be the highway from Brittany to Paris, it does indeed make you also closer to Berlin. So in some sense, it's not that crazy. On the other hand, there are many other forms of nation building or nationalism that make you closer to Paris, but they don't make you closer to Berlin at all, like forcing you to speak French, things of that sort. So we model other form of homogenization that increase the benefit of victory because they put you closer to Paris, but they don't put you closer to Berlin. And in that case, homogenization is more, that type of homogenization becomes more, more profitable for the elite. And then we also model we also model another form of nation building, which is instead of building public goods, and maybe this may be related to something that was asked earlier, instead of building public goods at home, you invest in making your people hate the enemy. So the absolute negative forms of nationalism that, that you spend a lot in anti-foreign propaganda and you don't spend anything on public goods, and so we allow a technology that makes, which is written over there, that makes people hate the public good of country B in order to increase their cost of a defeat rather than increasing the benefit of victory. And given that it's getting late, the benefit, the elite will choose this anti-enemy propaganda as opposed to a positive form of nation building, namely public goods and homogenization. They will choose no public goods and anti-foreign propaganda. When GB is large, so when the public good of the other country is huge, the cost of losing, it became very expensive to compete with the other country. So you want to have your people hate the other country because you cannot compete with GB because it's very expensive for you to have a GA which is high enough to compete with GB. The country is homogeneous. So if a country is already very homogeneous, you don't gain. What's the intuition from that, Alessandro?
You don't gain much from doing progress.
Oh, that's right. You don't gain much. If the country is already very homogeneous, we are all the same. You don't gain much by doing more homogeneity within your country because you're already very homogeneous. So you want to support in the extreme case we are all the same. There is no reason to homogenize. If you're all in Paris, there is nothing you can do. You're all in Paris. The only thing you can do is to make people hate Berlin. And when the fiscal capacity is small, when you have low tax revenues, it may become cheaper to spend on making you hate Berlin rather than build public good in Paris.
Sorry, I'm a little confused here. So I can understand that it's helpful to make the Alsatians like the public goods from Berlin less, but if they're getting no public goods from Paris, isn't public goods from Berlin still better? Like, what am I missing? So I thought, if there is any positive amount of public good provided by Paris, then of course making you dislike those from Berlin.
You want to decrease?
So it's true that there is the outside option of losing, it's not bad, but if you want to decrease, by decreasing the value of the foreign public good, you decrease
So the net benefit is the utility from winning.
Okay.
And the utility from winning is whatever it is with zero public good and some whatever it is. And the benefit of lose, you increase the cost of losing.
Exactly. I think that it's a model, like this is a case of Soviet Union. Like if you think about Far East, they should be conquered by Japanese during World War II because they're like, but because of this, and they had zero public good, but because of this anti-foreign propaganda, they might succeed.
Also then we don't have it in the slide, but in the paper we also then make, well, we don't make taxes endogenous, but we discuss the issue of allowing TA to change, namely to make the elite chooses to invest in nation building. And the one thing that we throw into the discussion, which is actually that we found some historical reference suggesting that the view of building a state capacity to fight war, I mean to tax more to buy guns, of course is there, but on the other hand there is a trade-off because if you tax people more, people are less happy and they're not so willing to fight if they know that they have to pay a lot of taxes. So there is this trade-off between taxing people more and make them less happy to be part of a country with high taxation. On the other hand, you need the taxes to pay for wars, and maybe the second effect of taxes, the benefit of taxes to buy guns, is dominating, and so wars build state capacity in that way. But there is also this trade-off that comes from lowering the effort of the soldiers. But in any case, as I said from the beginning, this issue of building state capacity is something that is pretty well known in the literature, so that's not what we go in there. But again, because of the linearity in our model, the elite, just to repeat what we said, the elite will choose whether to build public goods at home, or whether it is cheaper not to do any public good at home, but spend money in anti-foreign propaganda that may be cheaper than building your own so making you hate Berlin more than building public good in Paris may be cheaper. So the conclusion, we argued that nation building is related to the increase in the size of armies, not only because of the standard model of building state capacity, but because the necessity of mass armies and conscription led to state building, provision of public good, and nation building, which are the pillar of the modern nation state. And so, again, with the French Revolution and Napoleon and so on, at the time when wars became a mass enterprise in a country like France, you couldn't have people from little villages that couldn't care less about France fight a war. You needed to create a feeling of patriotism, and that led to nation building and provision of public good that were necessary to create incentives to fight. And I think going back to the point about the First World War, you needed to make people feel French and not proletariat to fight for France and not for Marx. Yeah.
Thank you for the paper, very interesting. Now, a couple of suggestions. One is that all this change in the army and the army size and behavior also takes place at the time of building of empires. And then the role of the army is very different because this is occupy land. I mean, UK sent soldiers to the US to occupy the land, not to. There was nothing to grab. Spain occupied Latin America. France also had an empire, and maybe first the growth of the army is caused by imperial strategy, and second, the role of the army changes because it's not just conquering next town and sacking the town, but it's just occupying new land, maybe because then you export stuff to the metropolis or whatever.
That would be a nice connection with the paper we heard before by Giacomo, Jaume, and Gino about at the same time, well, in some sense, you were not here, I think, but when they were talking about building of empires and the role of countryside and building of empires, and I was telling them, yes, but in addition to building empires, also nations were changing. We were building nations, and we are focusing on building nations, and you're saying, yes, but at the same time, we were also building empires. So there are two things going on at the same time. So that's absolutely right.
And another question, because I'm taking into account maybe it's irrelevant, is that you enlarge the army and you're reducing the labor force. So maybe you're reducing the tax rates. But maybe
no, right.
It's not empirically relevant that time because it wasn't.
No, I think it. I think you are pointing to an important point, actually. More generally, as you may have noticed, we don't deal with how you finance the war. So, in a sense, to be semi-serious, the model implied there are soldiers, a lot of soldiers fighting with their hands against each other, but there are no guns, there are no big expenses for the war. But if we put in the financing of the wars, then we would have issues of taxation, borrowing, labor force, and all of that, which we don't have. But sure, there are all these effects having to do with financing of the war, including the labor supply effect. But we don't have it. Yeah.
Sir, one question. One maybe very naive, like, so here basically the objective or the goal of the war is to conquer the other end, etc. But what if imagine some countries which is not super strong or not super large, they just take some defensive force, and then the winning of the war cannot gain the public good of the other ones. It's just basically it's nothing.
No, that is. I think that I don't think that much. I suspect that not much would change in the sense that here, well, of course, the algebra would change, but as long as you need the effort of the soldiers to win even a defensive war, and as long as the effort of the soldiers would depend on things like homogenization and supply of public goods, you would have the same kind of result, with the, of course, with a different algebra, because if you wouldn't conquer the other country. But I think the general nature of the result would go through, because the key element here is not, for country A, the key element is that you want to win the, so what would change was the definition of net benefit. The net benefit would be the cost of losing would be the same, and because you get conquered, and so the cost of the loss would be the same. The benefit of winning would be to stay with what you are without conquering country B. I think the result would be very similar. The result would be very, very similar. Well, now,
To incentivize the soldiers, because
but you still want to incentivize. I suspect that.
You could pay them from your own tax revenue.
Right. I think you're right. You would not have the spoils of war, but you would pay them with your rent. You would have an incentive to reduce your rents and pay the soldiers. I think the result would be very, very similar, actually. But it's an interesting point to. Yeah.
One question. Since I don't think we are really, the wars are not body to body now. And we are not talking about the real situation of war, and we are not talking about, well, the models of the 19th century and the World War II are already gone. We don't fight like this anymore. My question is, all that mechanisms between the elite and the public or the society would apply, like homogenization, would apply more or less in the same way. You were not talking about real wars, but social mechanisms of the elites with the society now. You know, like
Well, I mean,
like we're not in a war, but it's like if we were in a Cold War. It's not Cold War, but there are wars in the sense that two countries fight for power, no? And then all these economic mechanisms would apply now. The same.
Well, certainly not exactly the same. I mean, this is a paper about nation building, and nation building was in the 19th century. But I guess even but perhaps even today, even today, if you're talking about disagreement between countries, certainly would be an incentive for the ruling elite today to create within the European Union, for example, if you if you think about the response to the crisis, there's been an increase in nationalism. And, you know, the Germans talking about the Greeks are lazy, or the Greeks talking about the Germans as Nazi, or so there has been an increase in an animosity that may be sort of related to a negative form of nationalism. So yes, to mutatis mutandis, one can think of more generally nation building, both positive and negative, as a response to conflict within countries, which are not necessarily a war, but or a Cold War, or any kind of perhaps economic conflict. Yeah, that's actually very interesting.
For example, of Catalonia versus Spain,
Oh,
like the forces.
I will try to stay away from that. I don't want to be shot dead.
If you want to make a lot of friends in development, I can turn to you the question that I was asked before and suggest that maybe we have too many civil wars in developing countries because they don't have enough external wars anymore to engage in nation building.
That's possible. Yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe. Yeah.
In the Model 1, the Allies, the optimal problem are discussed case by case, that whether we are in a conflict, right?
Say it again. I missed.
I mean, in the Model 1, the Allies problem of each country are discussed case by case, that we are whether we are in a conflict.
All right.
I mean, whether could we impose an exogenous probability that the war will happen, so that the homogenized effort taken by the Allies be a function of the probability that the war will happen. Because in real life, the homogenized effort is a time-consuming process, and you can, when the war is already happened, you do not have the time to take the effort. So I mean, whether
no, I think you're absolutely right. I think you're making two related points. One is that the homogenization effort of country A is a function of the homogenization level of country B, which is certainly true. For simplicity, we take country B as exogenous, because otherwise it gets. And the second point you are making is that yes, homogenization is a long process, and clearly we have a peace and war, but in reality you have peace with some threat of potential war that may come, and that's a dynamic process, which I think would lead to similar results. But yeah, we are clearly a simplification. Either it's peace or war, but clearly there is a probability that the war may or may not happen, and that may last for decades. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you're right.